Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations, we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey. Hello and welcome back to the Red Light Exposé podcast. My name is Elly Arrow. I'm based in Germany. I'm an activist against commercial sexual exploitation. And today I have a special guest with me. I'm speaking to Esther. She is the Deputy Chair and Policy Advisor over at Nordic Model Now, which is a website I can only recommend all the listeners go and check out. I think the number one English language resource on all things commercial sexual exploitation, as well as policy solutions to it. And there are a number of brilliant essays by Esther over there that you can read, which you will find in the description. So Esther has a longstanding interest in research on legal and public policy approaches to sexualized violence and domestic abuse. And she also uses her own experiences of porn and prostitution to reflect on these. So before we jump into today's topic, Esther, do you want to let the audience know a little bit more about yourself?
Certainly. I'm a survivor of pornography and prostitution. And I originally became involved in it because of being involved in BDSM and going through a lot of very acrimonious relationship breakup, as a result of which I was about to become homeless. And I had no source of income. And then I met a very successful glamour model. And when I said to her that, I was involved in BDSM, I showed her some of the things I've done, she immediately said, "Why do you do that for free?" And I had no answer at all at that point. And then she told me that, the sort of niches like BDSM attracted higher rates of payment in prostitution. And she introduced me to the commercial sex website through which, in fact, she gained most of her income, because wealthy men are prepared to pay quite a lot of money to meet very well-known women, in both in porn and in kind of glamour modeling in private. She showed me how to set up an account, and then within 48 hours I was on there and met my first sex buyer. That's how easy it was. But it was at the point at which I had no home, I had no income, and I had no job. And I had experienced quite a lot of previous trauma. And that's the point at which I became involved in it. And once you're in it, it's like domestic abuse in that once you're in it, it's very difficult to get out of it. Because in a very short space of time, everyone you know is either also involved in the sex industry in some capacity or they're a buyer. You kind of start thinking that, the same things about how will I survive if I leave, all this kind of stuff, my whole social network will be lost, etc. I was particularly anxious about not having anywhere to live initially. I went from kind of one hotel to another around different towns in the south of England. And then I met up with a guy who ran a group on one of these commercial sex websites, and he was based in London. So I moved to London, and once I was there, my profile was actually part of his group. He controlled the emails, and my phone number was on my profile, and so any of the buyers could contact me directly, or anyone else for that matter. He interacted with the buyers as if he was me. And then eventually through contacts he got me a studio in a very expensive neighborhood in London. But there were several other women involved in prostitution who were in the same block. But then after that, I had a roof over my head, but it was completely tied to my being involved in prostitution. At that point, I actually fitted the international definition of trafficking, although it's not the definition that we have in our domestic law in the UK.
I know this is like a totally shortened version of the story. There's a lot more there, and maybe later in the conversation we'll tie to some of your personal experiences wherever you would want to share about that. If you want to give us the summary of how you managed to get out and also how you became an advocate, because we know many women, once they survive, understandably, it's like, let's figure out a new life, a new strategy to survive without the exploitation, hopefully apart from the various abusers. And advocacy is potentially retriggering. It demands a lot. What motivated you then later to say you want to speak up?
When I left the sex industry, it was very much against my will, because I still bought into the whole "I'm empowered, I'm making a lot of money" mantra. And like a lot of women I've met subsequently who are in the industry, you tend to reward yourself. So you make these really wild purchases some of the time. And when you do have money and sort of doing things around budgeting becomes really complicated because you're stuck with issues around reward in your brain, and you're kind of, it's like a reward thing. Oh, I'm going to reward myself for this. But anyway, I had all of that. I'm empowered. And my family found out what I was doing. And a couple of them invited me to dinner, and they sort of very strongly suggested that I leave because they considered it sort of like dishonorable for our family. So I just told them mind their own business. I'm making a lot of money, and I didn't really pay attention. Well, first I got a letter inviting me to come to a mental health sort of assessment, and I thought that was some kind of a joke. And then a couple of days later, 2 nurses turned up where I was living, because I was where I was living and where I was also seeing buyers. And I said the same thing to them. I'm empowered. They should mind their own business, etc. And they went away. And then about a few days after that, 2 psychiatrists came, and I was compulsorily detained on an adult psychiatric ward. I know so many survivors that never happened to. It has entirely to do with the kind of some of the class connections that members of my family had. One of them was a consultant medic, and the opinions of consultant medics will override the opinions of nurses, and very much tended to start conversations with, I am a fellow at the Royal College of Physicians, etc. And the other one was a sort of a director level of a global human rights organization. So, between those two. But the thing that was because I know people who were in a much worse situation than I was, where they were entirely regarded because of their class backgrounds as, that was a lifestyle choice and no one was going to interfere with it. The thing that was very striking to me, which I only realized a while later, was that the very day that the nurses came and I told them I was empowered, I'd had the last of a whole series of tattoos done on every single one of my limbs, because I had been kind of like choked, strangled, suffocated, sort of defecated on, had the whole thing about sort of buyers marking me, and being quite convinced that I am going to die where I am, but I can't see any way out of it. I clearly thought that somewhere inside. So I thought that if I had tattoos, then a buyer might think, oh, it's going to be difficult to get rid of this person's body. And that if they did kill me, it would be easier to identify me afterwards, and that would be a deterrent in itself. So I was completely detached. I was sort of like looking at myself from above at the same time as saying these things about empowerment, because it was really difficult for me to accept how I got into that situation. And then when I was on this psychiatric ward, I was very angry about the whole series of events that had resulted in me becoming sort of just the whole trajectory of the several years previously. And a nurse happened to called me in and said, why are you angry? And then when I started telling him, he said, write it down. I wrote quite a lot down. And then he was clear that he believed me when I said things, and that he acted. Where there were things in his control, he actually took some actions to support me. And I was not expecting that when I was a psychiatric inpatient who'd been involved in prostitution. I got a very kind of fit person who was the consultant, the senior doctor on my ward, wrote a very fierce letter about how I needed to have a roof over my head above all other things, which was true. A lot of the support I had isn't available anymore because of public funding cuts and cuts in a lot of services. But the thing that got me back into, well, for one thing, the organization which one of my family members works for decided that prostitution was work, which I found highly ironic. And then I discovered the impact of austerity budget spending cuts, including austerity budgets in other countries, which resulted in more women being trafficked into the UK. The kind of prices that women could charge for some of the really extreme services had come down quite dramatically. I found out what a woman had been paid to be a human toilet. And that was when I thought, if that has gone down that much, that means that there's a lot of competition. A lot of women are doing that. That's something which has been identified by Amnesty International and other organizations as a form of torture if it's imposed on detainees. You can't consent to that even if you're paid. Payment doesn't get you out of it. It would be bizarre if it was something you could be contracted to do when it's been identified as a form of torture, etc. So that's kind of how I connected up with the team from Nordic Model Now, and that's how I became involved, really. One of the first things I wrote for Nordic Model Now was an article in the New York Times about the acts that were inflicted on some of the detainees at Guantanamo, because almost all of them had been inflicted on me at some point in either films or by buyers. And so I was sort of like, well, that is torture. You say it's torture if it's in Guantanamo. It's also torture if it's being inflicted on women who, as a result of poverty and a whole lot of other challenges, end up in prostitution. you know you can't consent to it. It doesn't matter who the person is. It's that act is torture. And I think from the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, if it causes more than trivial low-level harm, any kind of enduring harm, then it is something a state has to compensate you for, both if its agents did it and also if it allowed it to happen on its territory. So that's kind of how I became involved in activism. There's a quite recent case which is called EA versus France, which involved a woman, her boss in her workplace got her involved in a BDSM contract. And she was very severely injured by this person who was her boss, her supervisor. He was initially convicted of something very minor, and then even that conviction was thrown out by the Court of Appeal, went to the European Court of Human Rights, and they decided France had violated Article 3, the prohibition on torture. I mean, they had some very interesting comments to say about the nature of coercion in that judgment. They found the issues around sort of what was consensual and non-consensual, and they ruled for the plaintiff, and she was given order to be paid some costs. But the European Court in that judgment said that any commitment to maintain sexual relations could be revoked at any time. If you can revoke a commitment to sexual relations at any time, where does that leave a contract between a buyer and a woman in prostitution?
Theoretically, according to German law, I can only speak because I know the legislation here, he is obligated to pay if she has delivered at least some of the so-called service, but she would be able to theoretically stop 2 minutes in, I guess. But would that ever fly on the market? Like, it's like you don't,
Yes.
It doesn't matter if that's the law on paper. If you are known as the woman who does the absolute minimum and then tries to remove the man or to throw him out, you're not going to sustain, you're not going to last. And you are at severe, like I have studied 40 years of prostitution context homicides in Germany. Disgruntled so-called customer is one of the biggest perpetrator groups of femicides.
Oh, yes. Absolutely is. And I used to have buyers coming in, and because I'm very tall, they would immediately assume I was a trans woman if they hadn't met me previously.
Oh.
And I would then be subjected to either threats of or actual very high levels of violence. I got to this thing where if I showed them my cesarean scar, that would satisfy them that I wasn't. It's just really terrible that somebody would expose trans women to that kind of level of threat from buyers. And I was once beaten up in the street by somebody because I had a trans woman who was on the site saying that they were on the site, didn't say that they were trans, as one of my friends in my group, people who I had been booked by buyers with. So having buyers come up in thinking that they're not going to get what they've paid for, that happened very often. The buyers would be just enraged at the idea that they were not going to get what they had paid for. Their sense of entitlement is absolute, and you are going to be in big trouble if you don't satisfy that sense of entitlement. And if you try to say, I'm independent of buyers' demands, you just won't encounter many of them. That's why it's inherently coercive, the way that it works. Yes. And it's inherently pushing right up against the idea of autonomous consent.
Like, it's an absolutely horrific story of what you went through, but depressingly, it's standard. I talked to women from around the world, and this is the standard story of women's, close call survival of prostitution. And this is not reflected in a lot of what the public perceives the industry to be. They are sold this story about, maybe not always middle-class women. It can be lower-class women, but for them, it's like an economic opportunity. They can rise up in their status. They can even meet some of these powerful, interesting men. And as long as these women have control over when, where, who, what practices, we're all good. And this is presented as the majority of the industry. Now, apart from the fact that even some women where that description might actually apply, it just takes one dangerous, hateful man who wants to take it out on a woman that day for her to end up hurt too. This is a fantasy. This does not reflect even the situation of a lot of women who don't have a flesh and blood pimp, even though he's never that far away as you described. You might have not been physically pushed by a gang, but somebody trying to profit off of you and control more of your day-to-day is never far away. But even apart from those people, there are all these different things that end up really controlling your day-to-day, the prices, the acts, whether you're able to turn somebody down, that are not really acknowledged in any of the public conversation, or that, as you described, even when you're in it yourself, you're telling yourself, it's okay, I'm empowered, I got this, because you have to. I mean, there's so much to say there. What comes to your mind?
Sort of at the beginning, I was I was what you would have called independent. Even when I was in this group where my account was controlled by someone else. And when I tried on that website to set up a different account so that I didn't have, I wasn't sort of down as doing so many of the BDSM and fetish things, after 48 hours, my account was deleted. And I couldn't remove the other one because of who controlled the password. But even if you consider yourself independent, you're not independent of buyers' demands. And they are really heavily influenced by trends in the global market in online pornography. And that is influenced by the stuff that you can now have acts of murder, mutilation and stuff happening in conflict zones coming out on just regular social media.
Yeah.
I really think that that is what a lot of the porn is competing with. They're competing with in the attention cycle with these very violent acts. And you've seen that they have videos of actual murders of women, tortures and murders of women put out there, and that is the bar. You have to perform increasingly extreme and dangerous acts just to keep up with the competition.
Yeah.
I had a guy who was a British businessman, but he ran a couple of corporal punishment porn websites that are based in Hungary. When he met me, this was in the BDSM scene, his opening requirement was that before he even spoke to me, he would cane me 100 times. And that was the bar for getting into his films. And I just thought, this must be like normal and you just have to get over it. Then I discovered that, in fact, he had agents working for him in Budapest who picked up very young women who were on the street who had issues with substances. And they would pay them in drugs for being in these films. The bar around really serious violence gets kind of higher and higher. And when also you had austerity, meaning more women being drawn into prostitution, and then more women being trafficked into the UK from countries which were even worse affected by austerity, that was pushing a lot of these prices down. That's why in the European Court of Human Rights case that was brought against France for introducing the Nordic model, the European Court of Human Rights said that all the things that the complainants had said, all these things that the Nordic model had increased danger and caused more extreme, risky situations. And the European Court of Human Rights is not interested in any appeals to emotion. It's not interested in the stories of individuals. It's interested in data. And when they, at the highest level, including the highest level for global human rights organizations, the court decided that all of the things that were being complained about had been present and had been observed before the Nordic model was introduced. It was not caused by them. Mm-hmm. It was caused by a lot of the other factors that were drawing women into prostitution. That in fact, the Nordic model seeking to reduce demand and take better action against traffickers and pimps and things, that was not what the driving force was. The driving force was what you're being told, things like online porn are scripting as normal activities and what you're competing against in that market. And so that's why even if you think yourself independent, if you go onto the main websites one of the main websites in the UK, the one that I was on, it actually has, you go in, there's like a menu of things that you have to say on your profile, whether you do them or you don't do them. That's entirely derived from online porn.
Yes.
And including the euphemistic names they give to different things. And so you kind of go on there and have you even heard of this stuff? And it was clear to me that lots of the accounts were controlled by others because I quite often be booked with another woman by a buyer. And when I get there and you say, assure me that this woman does the things that they want both of us to do, to receive usually. And then I would find out that in fact, this woman had no idea whatsoever, didn't speak English very well, and had been sent there, but it was the person who controlled her account, which mine was also controlled by another person, who had assured the buyer. And then it's a really difficult situation from my point of view about that this person has not consented. And this is just the most dire environment, because if she doesn't do things, then the person who sent her is probably going to be violent towards her. And then the buyer would quite often be very apologetic about, they didn't tell me the truth about what they were going to do, but that hadn't deterred them. And the same buyers used to call me on my phone number and say, you speak English. I said, what do you mean I speak English? And they read my profile and they'd say, but when I call up, most of the time it's somebody who doesn't speak English well. So, well, you don't notice that if their profile is written well, and it isn't that the profile's written in bad English, it's that when they call up and somebody clearly isn't the person who wrote the profile, that doesn't make them stop. There's very big competition that has been driving all of this stuff. In pornography itself as well.
Everything you're describing mirrors the situation in Germany, where famously most of the activity in the industry is legal. And it's taken years and years and years to raise awareness in the public that, two things, right? Human trafficking and non-trafficked prostitution are not separate. They're on the same websites. They have a vast overlap in so-called clientele, an overlap in a lot of the party profiteers that includes like the brothel owners, the website owners. And then also that just because a flesh and blood pimp is not there does not mean these women, when they're alone in the room with the men who pay, have some fundamentally different experience that's more akin to one-night stands, which can be boring or a bit unpleasant, but are not seen by the general public as something that you desperately need to protect people from. These things we've been pushing against for a while and started to make a dent in the public perception. But I see like in the, especially in the English speaking world, this like sex work and trafficking, those are two different things, is some kind of gotcha. And it takes us writing essays, right? And it takes exited women and survivors having to divulge all these traumatic details to like break through the brain fog this creates, right?
Yes, and because in England and Wales, the way that our modern slavery legislation defines sex trafficking, there's a requirement of travel, either into, out of, or within the UK, but in England and Wales. But there's also, they have to prove one of our sex offences. So they have to prove like rape or sexual assault. But if you're receiving cash at the door, and we already have a tiny proportion of the complaints about rape ever get to the stage of a conviction, tiny. And if you already have a system where you accepted cash at the door in return for doing something, that makes it even less likely that you would be able to establish that. So, in fact, the police use other laws a lot of the time. So that it's basically downgraded compared with, say, slave labor or sort of servitude, where you can simply show this person is being paid less than the going rate for this activity. But when you have the going rate for being paid for different sex acts has dropped fantastically, and you're still saying there's no problem here, it's all independent.
Yeah.
It is very striking.
Yeah, everything you're describing is the same here, even though supposedly legalization is supposed to make it able for authorities to have oversight. Who is in the industry? What's the situation? When do we have to intervene? None of that has actually come to fruition. But we'll have to make another episode where we deep dive into Germany. I feel like Germany is a good proof of how this cruelty and volatility and dehumanization is the nature of the industry. And you can see how impotent laws are in doing anything about it.
Because I think there also has to be kind of like education of the public about what is involved. One of the things that people don't seem to understand is that if you are a migrant woman who does not have the right to work in the EU or the right to work in the United Kingdom, you are not going to want to be registered somewhere where that's going to come to the attention of the immigration authorities. The group that I was on, there was another profile in the same group where there were 6 Brazilian women operating through that profile, a heavily photoshopped picture. They had all been lied to in Brazil by being told, oh, you're just going to take gentlemen to dinner. But the people who sent them over had these highly photoshopped photos taken before they left, which would have been used against them if they had complained in the UK. Some of the older women, when they got here, no one had said, you can't have a tenancy, you can't rent a property, you can't open a bank account. They were completely dependent on the other women there. And the older women made the younger ones do things that the older women didn't want to do anymore. But there are lots of things that if you'd been somebody who didn't have these restrictions, you might have thought, well, yeah, buyers sometimes ask you if you'll make films, or porn companies ask you if you'll make. They don't want to do that. They don't want a permanent record of their involvement in sex trade. Don't want to be registered. Even when they got there and they realized that they'd been misled, they was like, well, we're going to get out of this at some point, so we just regard this as temporary. Although, in fact, this didn't happen. And I saw that they were getting more and more into kind of using alcohol and things to numb what was happening. They were in a group, 3 of them, in a flat next to mine, and a guy came in and pulled a knife on them, and that one of them was raped. They couldn't do anything about that. It was one of the most heavily guarded parts of central London. Then they were at this sort of 24-hour sex party place, and I said to them, that's very likely to be raided because there's going to be noticed by people that there's all these things going back and forth. And the caretaker there told them that he wanted them to pay a weekly rate for him not to report them to the immigration authorities. And when they refused, 48 hours later, they were raided, they were deported. So, but they would be a group that they wouldn't be interested in something where their name was held by the state. And this would also be true in the UK if women were on benefits, and it might come to the attention of the tax authorities, or they might be investigated for benefit fraud, things like that, because we tend to prosecute that a lot more heavily than we do some other offences. It's kind of war against very impoverished and marginalised people, and they would all be people who'd be in the underground. And so when you look at the size of the underground in Germany, it isn't the Nordic model that drives things underground. It's those kind of factors.
Yes. Yes.
And when they've also been trafficked. But it's the fact you have a permitted system and that you're not doing anything about demand that makes you attractive, and people will come in. Quite often that women who were involved in the German porn industry came to the UK to meet buyers who paid very large sums of money to meet them in private.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't be registered with a brothel either.
Yes.
So I find it interesting when you're talking, I know we're probably not going to talk about the German system here, but if you have to be licensed, does that include every time you meet somebody in private where there is a reward, you have to be licensed? We have things like kind of like sports teams, so like their agents might go and recruit amenable women who would come to parties they were at. That also happened to the glamour model who introduced me to the website I was on. But where does it become something that requires licensing as prostitution rather than that you're getting some kind of reward, whether it's career advancement or anything else, from having sex with relatively random strangers?
No, I mean, that's the whole subject in of itself, how the policies are always decades behind how the market is evolving. And they're not even able to, like a lot of our current prostitution laws don't even apply to anything online.
Yes.
So that would be camming, or even escort websites are not regulated, really.
That's what I was wondering about, because I was thinking, if you did what we call out calls, where you would go as an individual to like a hotel or to somebody's house, that doesn't come under the licensing system, does it?
I think some of the escort agencies are registered, but because a lot of the practical things that you can apply to a brothel, like you can send a government representative and check, do they have a emergency button system? We can then have a whole discussion, and we have a whole episode talking about how these safety measures don't work, even in a brothel setting. It's harder to do that for an escort agency. Are they supposed to have some kind of app? How does that work? Is she supposed to have like her phone grabbable at any time? How is that practical when you're in an unknown location with an unknown man? And it's a paper tiger, the German law. I would happily do another episode where we just go through the German law bit by bit and tear it apart. There's so much there, which looks good to the outside, but actually the nature of the industry defies the regulation, defies the oversight. Like you said, it wants to stay underground because it's criminal, because the hate, the societal hate and rejection of the women is still sky high.
Yes.
Because the buyers want anonymity. As you will undoubtedly know, they're frequently partnered. That will never change. It doesn't matter what the law is. There is always a lack of genuine volunteers, way more demand. Every party involved has a need for discretion, so the law will always fumble trying to do a harm reduction only approach.
Yes. Yeah, well, you sometimes get a bit different commentators saying, oh, why are we so prudish nowadays? Why can't we be like, the 18th century, kind of like a man about town, et cetera, et cetera? It's because women have control over reproduction. It's because women can divorce. It's because women have other opportunities in life. So everything that makes it more, so that a buyer has a lot more to lose by being revealed than was the case in the 18th or 19th century. So that has given more power to the people who are at the top of what you might call the hierarchy, or the people who can control who knows who the buyer is. They're the buyers themselves because they dictate, their demands dictate a lot, and it's people who control their information about who the buyers are. Another thing I found very noticeable was, this was particularly if I was asked to go and visit somebody outside, go to wherever they were, is that a lot of the time buyers who are partnered or in relationships, they pay for a woman in order to, it's like a private act of violence against their spouse or partner. Yeah. I had a fight with my wife, I'm going to go and pay, or my wife's gone away for a weekend, I'm going to pay so that this person can come into the same bed that we sleep in. And they do that to feel like one up against their spouse or partner. And or sometimes, in their office where they don't like their female boss, something like that. There's a lot of misogyny in that. But also that they're more likely to be violent towards women in general. And I would quite often get a buyer come along doing one of these fetish or extreme things for the purpose of then saying, oh, I can connect you up, we can go out together with my wife, but don't say how we met, and then we can do this. They would be normalizing a lot of these very violent acts, going to their partner or wife and saying, oh, I know someone who does it. No, you don't. You know someone you paid to do it. It's not the same thing. But they were just basically trying to normalize through a lot of society some of this stuff that's driven by violent porn.
We're really at this stage where I'm seeing like opinion pieces that are supposed to convince the non-prostituted female public that if their partner or spouse goes to a brothel or any part of the sex industry, it's like getting a massage. He's like just treating himself. And if, you don't have the energy to like massage him today, no problem. A professional will take care of it. It's such upside down. I'm sure you see these articles all the time.
Yes. It's kind of unusual because you also have this phenomenon across many different countries across the world of young people having less sex than their parents did. True of the US, but even more other countries, young people not having relationships, not wanting to be in
Yes.
relationships, and a lot of that is being driven by women, in young women in those countries. But a lot of the kind of commentators still talk in terms of, women's mating preferences are this or blah. And it's like, well, hello, have you seen any of this stuff? But when they're sort of talking about choices, they are not helping at all. And I think that's very concerning also when you look at the influence, because the model has sort of changed. It was the case before that if you did films, if you were in films, buyers quite often ask you to make films with them, or somebody might ask you that's company, and they might appear in it, or they might find somebody else who would be in it with you. I was really shocked when the man who controlled my group said, if you need a man to be in that film with you, just put an ad out on your profile and you don't need to pay them. I said, what do you mean you don't need to pay them? So, well, yeah, there's loads more, that it would be a free ride. If they got to have sex with you on film, they would be getting something that buyers would charge, so they don't get paid. But the films were like in the music industry, putting something on Spotify or on YouTube. They were sort of like advertising for you, especially if you were with somebody who was well known, because then buyers pay more, or you get more buyers because you've got this person on your sort of friends list who's well known. The more people have seen your videos for free, the more that you'll be paid. But that's different now that you've got OnlyFans. Because of the subscription model there. Then you can have subscribers. You're doing this content. And I was very surprised when they had the current, Lily Phillips and Bonnie Blue and people like that were there. So they are going back to stuff which is sort of from the 80s about extreme, how many, they're going back on the kind of numbers in a day and things like that.
Yes.
But all of that, because they're not allowed to be charging for sex, was free. So they're driving the price of having sex with somebody who's quite well known, certainly by the time they became notorious, down to nothing. And that, for at least for one of their events that happened recently, a man flew over from Zurich or somewhere in Switzerland.
Yes.
They have legalized prostitution there. They have women who I know in the brothels, women complain because the traffickers undercut them all the time. Well, now you have the traffickers undercutting them, and you have somebody who's actually flown from there to London in order to have free sex with somebody who's filming on OnlyFans. The pressure is always to try and make the cost of paying for sex less and less until it gets to practically zero. There's a big pressure on pushing the prices down. Has the law in Germany changed the number of German sex tourists that go to Thailand and other countries like that? I don't think so.
I'd rather say it's encouraged it. So it's like, if this is something that I already do, let's say once a month, roundabout, for the repeat buyers, some of them more frequently, but roundabout, then why not also do it on holiday? Rather than the man who's never done it, because, well, in the few cultures that do reject this, or at least officially reject this, I'd anticipate he'd be less likely and more hesitant than if he's sort of been culturally conditioned into it.
Yes.
My understanding is that there's been a study that asked about men's first time of purchase and found that most men start in their 20s. Okay, first of all, we do have cultures where they start as teenage boys or are pushed into it by older peers or family members. But on average, in let's say Europe, it's in their 20s. And if they are not conditioned during that age, most likely they will not start at a later point, just statistically speaking, as far as I know, which is, somewhat encouraging, because there is a critical time period of socialization that applies to prostitution. That probably also applies to porn use, although porn use, we're now talking about like 11-year-olds. I mean, none of us are saying that a Nordic model would make the industry appear overnight or even within a single generation, but it still matters to diminish it. It still matters to signal to a society that you cannot do this to women. We cannot live together doing this. And the more countries that do it, the better. And I would anticipate the better behaved those men are when they go abroad as well. Because Germans are absolutely notorious across Thailand, horrendously notorious for what they're doing to Thai women and some young men and some children.
Yes, well, because that's where a lot of the drivers were going. I mean, I quite often had men calling up my phone number, which was publicly available in my profile, asking me whether I liked young, by which they meant children. And they were accessing children on the dark web, and or also just, in fact, mainly a lot of it through the main social media sites, through connections that they had made through there. It's a combination of what porn saturation does to your ability to get aroused, but also I think some of the substances that the men would consume, particularly cocaine, but not only that, where they would be unable to be satisfied and they would just go more and more along extreme lines. But I think some men, there are all-party parliamentary group on commercial sexual exploitation did a report about kind of men who pay for sex, and they're pointing out quite a lot of men get introduced to it if they've gone on a stag night or things like that, or
Yes.
that's when they're going out before someone gets married, or some of these group things. And there were occasions when I was booked in those scenarios where I could tell some of the men didn't really want to be there. There was a very strong group pressure thing, and sometimes very awkward situations about they wanted to go and hide somewhere and not be, because it was like a group bonding exercise, and that would be used. And some of them knew that would be used against them later in some way. Oh, we know what you did. We're going to tell your girlfriend and all this kind of stuff. And yet in the group dynamic, it was very difficult for them. I found that also a very awkward situation. But that happened quite a lot. I was not certain that all of the people in that group consented to it. But then once they get into it, it becomes part of their peer behavior. And then they might then as individuals carry on.
Yeah. I mean, I've wondered too, my focus is on the human rights crisis around what the prostituted people, the sexually exploited people, mostly women and girls, are going through. But the system is, as far as I can see, so dysfunctional that even the buyer will somewhat frequently be in situations he didn't really want, that the culture convinced him he wanted, or the peers. Like even the pornography use, it's not like men who sign up for pornography addiction make a conscious choice for all the ripple effects it has into their life. And I don't spend days worrying and crying for these men because as a group of how much harm they cause. But it just shows how dysfunctional system is, that even for them, not all of the sexual experiences are even really what they authentically want or what feels good to them in the moment or the long run. And that some of them, as we said, have to be pushed into. And just to be clear, of course, when it's somebody underage, that's just child abuse.
Yes.
And I don't see the public. The public's just over here talking about, does she want to be there? Does she not want to be there? And we can debate our personal definition of free choice. And then all these systems and dynamics were just starting to pierce the fog, as I said.
Yes. I mean, because I think the actual dynamic because if you're involved in prostitution, then you have buyer forums. The kind of buyers will remind you of what the competitors are prepared to do. That happened a lot, being contacted directly. And then otherwise, they're commenting in reviews on your profile itself or on buyer forums. I mean, this is very specific to the online culture in the UK, where the big commercial sex websites both facilitate and enable enormous expansion of sex trade. And it's like kind of calling up a pizza. But they can put reviews on your profile, which you can't take off. And they also on buyer forums where they say stuff which is every bit as racist and misogynist as anything anyone says on an incel forum.
Yes.
Particularly because some of them tell you how much they paid, and they make it very clear that somebody who is a white woman who speaks English well and appears educated, there's a premium of almost 100% for kind of escort services. I mean, that would be illegal in it. I couldn't go to a healthcare place and say I'm going to pay 100% more for a nurse if they're white and appear educated.
Oh, yes.
But that racism is completely accepted as a kind of divine right of kings.
In Germany, a lot of the Romanian women are pretending to be Greek, Italian, or Spanish. Based on complexion, they're trying to pass as Southern European because men will literally pay more. The less accessible a group of women is because of socioeconomic factors, the more men are willing to pay because it's, rare wares.
Yes.
So that's why the Romanian women do that, or the Chinese women or Thai women. I mean, China has, obviously the Chinese economy has improved, but there's still quite a lot of poverty. They will often pretend to be Japanese.
Yes.
And I've read from a number of buyers who go up to the woman and they speak a tiny bit of Japanese and that they see she speaks none. They know that women pretend all the time. So this would never fly. I will never stop being upset about how we say, oh, that Netflix film was insensitive about that culture. And over here is a brothel saying, destroy this tiny Asian, or here's your, a jungle mama.
Yeah. It's just, it's really incredible. And then you're worrying about these incel forums and saying, these young men, what are their fathers doing? What are their older male relatives doing? What are the fathers of their peers doing? I don't know whether they've decided that generation is just too corrupt to be fixable. And that's why they've got this obsession with young boys. But who were their role models? It's just incredible that level of racism is, and because it's all based on ideas of conquest. Oh, I've had this woman, or I've had that kind of woman, and you're kind of completely reduced to issues around race and ethnicity. And also the stereotypes that men have about that woman would do that anyway, or something like that. It just would not be tolerated anywhere else.
So for everything we're talking about, there's always 5 different roads we could go down. There's so much to talk about. So we did in our pre-chat for this say that we would try and focus on a type of coping strategy. Like everything we just talked about, I would hope most listeners feel similarly. This is unacceptable human rights violations. This is horror and torture in many, many, many cases. And still our culture, as well as understandably, a lot of women in the industry try and, dissociate from it, label it with nicer words so that neither we nor the victims have to really name what's going on. And you talked to me about this when we were planning like what to discuss, the million euphemisms there are just not to have to say prostitute. And there's like a new one every decade or every 5 years at this stage, right? Including like you were mentioning a glamour model. I honestly don't even know what a glamour model is.
Oh, that was we had that they would do sort of topless shots that were in our newspapers, most notoriously the Sun newspaper, but there were several others, and they would quite often become relatively mini celebrities, some of them in their own right. They would be kind of invited to lots of the kind of top nightclubs and things like that. It was considered prestigious thing to do. A glamour model would be a word for somebody who did topless shots.
So that's softcore pornography, but she would not want to call herself a porn performer or even porn star.
No, definitely not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I always find it odd that the media uses the word porn star, even if someone's only been in a couple of films. In a way, they promote it itself by putting that word. I mean, if you were in films in Hollywood, they would call you a star if you were somebody that had buying power for the whole film.
Yes.
If you were one of the minor parts, they would probably call you a Hollywood actress or something. But they call you a porn star for a few films, which also helps to kind of glamorize the whole industry, when the outcomes for a lot of the women who've been long time in the porn industry are extremely sad.
Yes.
What has happened is because lots of people, including lots of services in the UK, regarded somebody who was a prostitute as having made a choice. That meant that if, for example, if they came across young, very underage girls, when they referred to them as a prostitute, they were asserting that they had made a lifestyle choice, even though they were underage. It's really kind of really shocking and disgraceful that they did that. But it was the function that word had that indicated the making of a choice. Whereas when you look at the backgrounds, including the backgrounds of most of the women who are involved in prostitution as adults, enormous proportion, experienced child sexual abuse, expect domestic abuse, homelessness. They might have substance use issues themselves, or be with a partner who had very high levels of coercion, almost every form of marginalization. And you would still say that person was exercising a choice. I think it's interesting. We have these new offences of coercive control that were brought in connection with domestic abuse, where a sort of coercive environment, having sort of an intimidatory or coercive environment is recognised as having created one in the domestic abuse situation is regarded as an offence. But when there are different aspects of really big state failure to protect young girls and women, that is somehow overlooked, and it's called that they're making a choice rather than that they've received completely inadequate support and help from the state at really critical stages. And that, I mean, if they were better off, they might well have brought cases themselves under the European Convention of Human Rights about their state failure, but instead they're seen as having made a choice.
Yeah.
But also I get concerned some of the time that with a lot of things that we're doing a lot of work around, the UK has been doing a lot of work around domestic abuse, but because they won't put money in towards specialist services supporting women to exit the sex industry, they're getting close to saying that domestic abuse is a good woman who's met a bad man and is therefore deserving of support. Mm-hmm. Whereas women involved in prostitution are kind of damaged, chaotic, blah, blah, whatever other word, and they made a lifestyle choice and therefore are undeserving. Yeah. And where there are lots of other areas where people are supported to exit, or, there are lots of actual forms of labour where there's a lot of effort put into supporting people to exit. There isn't any with prostitution. So it's the way that it's used to suggest that you chose that, rather than that you had no other option. And that's what's made it really difficult.
That's kind of the lie of destigmatization. So I know, and I don't view everyone who is, who uses the term sex work or agitates that way politically as just pimp lobby, just exploiters. I do see that there's women who have lived the industry or are currently living it, who are trying to make the best of a bad situation. that's why I think it's so tragic that there's been this political promise of, if you carry the red umbrella and you use the term sex work and you say, we are proud, we are making a choice, this is a job, you will be humanized. And then police or social services or the general public will not, you won't be cast out of your social group. They will help you if a crime is committed against you. But actually, as we just described, unfortunately, it has a lot of the opposite effect. Instead, people think, well, this is the job you chose. Well, there must be something sexually deviant about you. You must be tougher or different than everyone else. And it is okay to subject you to things that we don't accept for anybody else. And actually, we don't need to help you because this is a normal job. Why would you fund exit service? We don't do that for bakers or whatever. So the destigmatization and the sex work language, women have been told this will humanize you to society. But I see distinctly in Germany that it's just air under the wings of victim blaming and relinquishing any societal or political responsibility towards women.
Yes, it's also really othering. You are an othered. You're an othered woman. You're a kind of somehow subhuman caste of woman who deserves to, be exposed to all these bodily fluids. I mean, in German industries, if you're going to be exposed to multiple body fluids, don't you have to wear full protection? Like in a healthcare setting, you wouldn't send people into a setting where they were going to be exposed to all the body fluids that you are in prostitution, or the very high level of kind of biological risk. You wouldn't send people without protection. I mean, the guidance that we have in the UK for people working in the care sector, you'd have to wear full protective gear. And also the level of injury that is regarded as acceptable wouldn't be regarded as that. And other industries which were considered harmful, like the use of asbestos in building material, or we have quite a lot of examples of this is regarded as a harmful industry, this practice is harmful. And there have very often been huge vested interests that tried to prevent that, but in the end they prevailed, and particularly with the support of the trade union movement.
Yes.
And that's why it's really baffling that over this issue, the trade union movement has decided to call it work. If it were changed in the UK so that contracts that involve payment for sex are illegal in the UK, not just in the criminal law, but are unenforceable. If you changed that, how you would stop sexual harassment at work in general, how you wouldn't have other industries saying, why do we have to go to all these lengths to make sure that we treat all our employees equally, regardless of age, sex, gender identity, race, etc., when you can charge different prices in prostitution? It would inevitably spread across there. And the same with the health and safety standards, which are also costly. All the things that are around regulation of business, which just don't exist in the sex industry, and as far as trying to avoid harm, societal harm through the overt racism and actual physical harm through the injuries to women. And it's intergenerational kind of injuries as well.
Which is what we see in practice is not actually like a sex worker union movement. That doesn't really exist because the women are at best independent contractors, at best self-employed, if not completely outside of any kind of even like semblance of regulation or paper trail. And at best, you can have a so-called professional association of independent contractors. We have them in Germany and they have like 200 members out of an industry of around 100,000 to several hundreds of thousands of people. What bargaining power do they have? Can they go on strike? No, none of that.
No.
We are even struggling to enforce condom use, which is the absolute basic minimum thing. Like, I mean, not that I think if prostitution has condom use across the board, it's fine, but right, we're asking for minimal protection. And even that, this so-called labor movement, sex work labor movement, is unable to do because of the nature of the industry. It's not like if we try harder, this will change. If a woman is in a different city every 2 weeks, which a recent government evaluation just confirmed, the high mobility, doesn't speak the language, how are you going to do a labor movement that then is able to keep the buyers in check, keep the brothel owners in check? It's a pipe dream.
Yes. Because they're not really unions, they're trade associations, and the principal beneficiaries are the people running the trade at the higher level.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look at what our unions have achieved, like our railway unions or our health service unions, in terms of the percentage increases for the members of their unions, railway workers, health workers, and then you compare that with the prices that women can charge having gone down even for stuff like being a human toilet because of the number of women who've been drawn in. It is exactly the opposite. And all the things that the people who are at the higher level of the trade want, they want to get market share, so they want the price to go down so they get more buyers. They are interested in their product costing less to the buyer, and you are the product.
Yeah.
And that's not the case with the occupations that are covered by unionized labor. You are the commodity. I can say, I want to buy Edam cheese or Italian gorgonzola, and I agree a price based on that description. I can't do that with human labor, at least not in the equality legislation we have in the UK, because that's what really shows that you're talking about trade in commodities. And the people at the top want the commodity price to go down to get market share, which is what they do with other products that they also bring in.
we haven't even mentioned yet the part about how this is the only industry, as far as I can tell, where men are willing to pay more for somebody less experienced and younger on average than somebody older, unless the older woman has like an elaborate advertising campaign to hike up her price, which I know that the pro-prostitution lobby always says, like, oh, we have this like 160-year-old dominatrix and she gets like 300 euros per hour. It's like, okay, good for her. But we're talking on average, the 18-year-old or 19-year-old from Romania is going to be booked more than the 45-year-old German woman. It's just a fact.
Yes. Part of it is age, but it's also how long you have been in the industry.
Yeah.
So that you might be a relatively new 45-year-old, because novelty is an obsession. It's a new woman, new this, new that. That's one of the reasons why there's a lot of movement around the place too. It's like new woman in this city and this sort of stuff. But if you've been there for a long time, you see this on the buyer forums. They'll say, oh yeah, I met so-and-so like 5 years ago when she was called this and she was whatever. And the longer you have been in the industry, the less buyers will pay for you. So it's like novelty. There are things like dominatrix. That's a very specific kind of service. But in general, it's not true.
Yes.
And I think even if you were a dominatrix over time, it would be, well, I've been to that person before, X number of times. And you don't say that about a doctor. So I've been to that doctor many times before, therefore I have to go to another doctor.
Or a massage therapist or a nurse. All these jobs or therapists, the political movement to legitimize prostitution loves comparing prostitution to the care professions. If you had a brilliant doctor, like you said, or a massage therapist or like whatever it is, you would keep going back. And that's not to say that there's no such thing as like repeat buyer in prostitution context, which bears its own dangers because these men get obsessed.
Absolutely does. Really does.
Yes. But generally speaking, like we said, there's a lot of fluctuation and demand for what a lot of the buyers would call their term fresh meat.
Yes.
Again, we would not accept this in any... Okay, people might say, okay, the modeling industry has some of that. Yet this is a problematic industry. We talk about the modeling industry. We talk about their obsession with youth and thinness as a problem that we want to do something about. We want to do something about the visual culture. And I cannot, like these feminist groups that are out here making complaints about, swimwear model ads that are objectifying. I'm not saying that's not a worthwhile cause. If they have a pornography blind spot, I cannot take them seriously.
No.
I'm just venting. Yeah, you know what I mean. But I wanted to circle around to something you said earlier about how normalization of prostitution has ripple effects into other professions. We don't have to speculate at all, right? We can look at the Netherlands, which is a really potent example, where a few years ago, their, I believe, biggest nursing union had to have a campaign, a public awareness campaign that a nurse does not offer handjobs. Because there was a new nurse trainee who flagged it with the union saying the other women are doing handjobs on disabled men, sick men, men with dementia. They think this is something that they have to do. Or this is something that they get harassed until they acquiesce. And she said, I won't do it. She spoke up. That's why we even heard about this, because of this whistleblower. And they had to run an entire campaign. So we're not speculating. This is exactly what happens. Women in care professions, women in service professions, sexual harassment, objectification, demands for various forms of prostitution intermingling with their otherwise, generally speaking, unproblematic profession or a profession that could be dignified and meaningful to society. That is happening.
Yes.
We have evidence of this. And the pro-prostitution lobby in Germany has this thing that they're really after, which is they want prostitution for the group of men I just mentioned, disabled, with dementia or long-term illness. They want that declassified. They want the prostitution for this group of men to become something else. They're trying to establish these new euphemisms of sexual care or sexual surrogacy to normalize the industry even further, which it's a bit confusing. At the same time, they're trying to not call it prostitution, which if I think about that, breaks my brain a little bit. Have you seen these efforts? Do you have thoughts about this?
A few years ago, there was an issue in the UK about, I think it was young men in certain care situations where I think it was young learning disabled men where that some of the carers who were supporting them were trying to help them access prostituted women to give them experience of sex. And there was a court case about it. They had actually been doing this, using funds to fund this, and then it was challenged in the court. I think it was challenged successfully. But one of the difficulties with that would be if you were talking about somebody who was experiencing dementia or was in some kind of confusion, what would happen to members of the staff they then encountered who were female? How would they be treating them if they were? Would they think that, oh, this is just part of my care package that this person provides these services? How would they necessarily distinguish between the person who's giving them a handjob and the person who isn't?
Yes.
There have been women who provide massage services, like Thai women who provide massage services in England have complained about the men coming in and just expecting that that's what they do. It can be very hard to be a massage provider in terms of having to keep yourself safe from men who might come in and assume you do that. But they had certainly complained that there were these assumptions made about what was available in their service. But I think that the expectation that you would give somebody a false idea about what sex was like instead of supporting them to have, even if it might take a while to get there, to have some kind of relationship with an actual human being that wasn't being paid.
Yeah.
I mean, would you be saying to somebody that everything is transactional and that, that they're not somebody who is actually ever going to be able to have a relationship with another person? I think it's undermining to them in itself.
It is. And again, we talk about the representation of disabled people in pop culture, and people have 100 opinions. But on this issue, like all the different precarious aspects, ethical concerns, okay, what about nonverbal men? So we have evidence that there are sometimes carers calling in a prostituted woman to so-called sexually satisfy or pacify nonverbal men. How do we know he's consenting?
Yes.
We already know how precarious it is for the prostitute woman, but now we have a situation where the buyer is actually, we had this case that went viral about a learning disabled man who had his carer then say, we are now a couple, we are dating, he wants this. And she was speaking for him, he could not talk, and she was supposedly able to interpret what he wanted to say. That was an international scandal, and I think there was like true crime, and like everyone was talking about it. This happens in care homes in the prostitution context at an unknown rate. Or men with dementia who might be able to verbalize, but that it is taking care of people with dementia is sensitive because just because they're saying, I want sex, that doesn't mean this is now a situation where that should actually be taking place.
Yes.
Right? But we had a green politician in Germany not that long ago advocate that insurance pay for this exact practice because there's just this messy beliefs about men have a right to sex and they must get it quickly and to their specifications. And if not, they are a danger to society. But also this is healing and harmless and half of it is cuddling. Like it's such a mess, but somehow still a very powerful argument, right?
Yes, because on the one hand, they're not having sex, they're having a whole bunch of scripts which are taken from sort of pornography. It's not about developing intimacy with another person together or anything like that. It's not what a genuine relationship based on mutual things would be at all.
Yeah. We've covered a lot of ground. Before we finish, I did want to touch on one more thing that I feel like is often forgotten. Like we said, the conversation often gets stuck at the stage of how many women want to be here, how many don't. And we don't take the bird's eye view. We don't take the long-term perspective. But something that I've been thinking about so much is the long-term outcomes for the majority of women in the industry. That's physically, emotionally, financially. Because again, the public narrative in recent years has so often been, okay, maybe it's a hard job, but just like if you tough it out at a shitty company or if you tough it out in another job, at least, you'll make decent money and you'll be set up to move on to bigger and better things or to retire early. There's a lot of that narrative that you can build wealth through the sex industry, and any harm it's done to you, well, the money will dry your tears. And this does not at all mirror the long-term outcomes of the women that I have encountered or spoken to or read about. But what are your thoughts about this promise of, okay, it might be tough, but it can lift you out of poverty long-term. This can lead the individual or even like nations. Like this, sometimes prostitution is literally by academics compared to economic development aid. What do you think about that narrative and the reality?
Well, I think that, the long-term trajectory of prices is downward.
Yeah.
And so that means more prostitution encounters more exposure to risk. Unless you get into a position where you're in a management or higher level position in the sex industry. I find it interesting that one of our two major pimping websites and say, I think OnlyFans, if they put a kind of like a female CEO in, not the kind of owner, but there'll be a female person put in there. that person will not have a background in prostitution. You're going to talk, they're going to take somebody who's paid to fake pleasure and say, oh yeah, this person's going to be honest about our trading figures. You would be regarded as untrustworthy, however much they might say, oh, it's great, you're a worker, they know that you're paid to fake pleasure, that they know that you're paid for this thing that isn't real. Unless you get into one of those higher level positions, which you're very unlikely to get into. It'll be other people who are in other industries who come in at that level.
There's just a limited amount of them too, right? There's not millions of porn company CEO positions in the first place.
No, the level of harm and the very, very high levels of PTSD and more severe than combat veterans, head injuries worse than boxers, etc. Very high. And also a lot of internal injuries that you don't show on the outside because your body is just not designed to take that much of abuse. Because buyers tend to get very excited. They're in a state of quite often quite high aggression when they meet you or they've been thinking about it. Your body is not designed to take that. But another reason why the trajectory is down is because of all these things like sex robots and AI that is ultimately going to take over things like OnlyFans. There'll be AI porn because it's already the case that porn is shot for different angles, not for pleasure. And so, why bother about some angle that is going to be really harmful if it's an AI image anyway? But then, that's got risks for what's going to happen to women when men who inevitably try to do that in real life. But things like the sex robots and stuff, the whole trajectory of it is going down to where the cost will be virtually zero for the buyer. And that's what you're competing against. And that's what interested me about Bonnie Blue and Lily Phillips saying, 100 men a day, 1,000 a day, that all of those guys, there are very large numbers of them queuing up because they're having sex for free. They're having sex for free with somebody who's quite a well-known porn actress. And who is now apparently going around in vans picking up men in the street. I mean, that's like the opposite of what we call curb crawling.
Yes.
That means that what's making you money in that industry is losing women money in prostitution.
Yeah.
So ultimately, it's a fight to the very bottom of the BMUG. Because I think it's interesting that Primo Levi, their writer, who wrote If This Is a Man, about his experiences in Auschwitz, he wrote some short stories, kind of science fiction volume called The Sixth Day. The story in there about a man who's a scientist and he's happily married to his wife. Then he decides to clone his wife. And his wife gets cloned, but the clone is completely devoted to the husband because it's her creator. She wouldn't exist without this. So she's kind of extremely submissive, The wife gets annoyed about this. And in the end, the husband clones himself. And so the wife then gets the clone of the husband, and basically they go off as two pairs. But I think that was written in the 60s, I think, but it's very prescient about the difficulty of actually having real relationships with people in all these simulacrums and all these sort of fake situations of which prostitution is one. It really affects the actual relations between men and women, whether you can trust. I mean, no man who's a sex buyer says that they are on a dating profile.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a survey there was a big opinion poll done by one of our big polling organizations last year where people say, oh yeah, we think that there should be a right to pay for sex and there should be a right to sell sex. But then very high numbers of people said they wouldn't want to be friends with somebody involved in prostitution or in porn, wouldn't want them in their social network, whether they were currently in it or whether they had been in it. So they were showing that in theory, I like it. In practice, I don't want you anywhere near me.
Mm-hmm.
But also, they didn't even ask, would you be friends with somebody you knew was a sex buyer?
Mm-hmm.
Would you, if they were currently a sex buyer, if they were previously, would you? They know the answer to that. Mm-hmm. Because it's sex buyers who are most invested in stigmatizing women in prostitution and keeping them silent because they have the most to lose. So they don't even ask that question. It's a given. So would you be upset if a family member of yours was a sex buyer? They don't even ask that. But they try to make it very stigmatizing for women involved in the sex industry to disclose their involvement, but the buyers must be protected at all costs. And so that's why the buyers are at the top of the hierarchy and the people who control the sex industry are at the top of the hierarchy, and they control a lot of the so-called unions and collectives. Their interests control that.
Absolutely. And that's why we do use the term pimp lobby, even though I would acknowledge that there are individuals or groups who think they're doing some kind of liberation of women. I don't know how you feel about that. I do feel that there are some activists who are genuine in their political goals, even if I think they're ultimately unachievable. But that does not cancel out the literal, like in Germany, it's more explicit because it's legal, brothel owner organizations. And obviously they have more funding. Obviously they decide which of the sex worker groups toes the line and will get some funding. And when they become legitimate businesses, they have connections to the regular industry or high heel shoe producers, condom producers, like whoever else profits. And that is why we do use the term pimp lobby. So There's always more to talk about. It's hard to find like a closing statement or thought, but I'm going to attempt one. And then you tell me how you would like to close the conversation. And I'm very happy to have another interview because I know there's 20 more things to talk about. Would you agree with the analysis or the sense that I see a lot of other feminists have as well, that so the sex industry has always been brutal, like this, we're not going to pretend otherwise, but we do see an increase in the level of sadism in the last few decades. And I've been told this by women who spend long years in the industry as well. They said it has gotten worse.
Yes, yes.
And this is during a time where, on average, globally speaking, even though there's some backsliding in recent years, female economic positioning and empowerment has improved. And it often feels like this is part of the backlash. Men see a lot of women who are more emancipated, economically speaking, socially speaking, that they've ever been. And they're refusing to arrive in modernity, or a lot of them are. There is a sexual, social, economic loss that comes when control over women or patriarchy, whatever term you want to use, is diminished. And this increased brutalization is part of the backlash. And then the smartest thing that you can do is brainwash these educated middle class, the women who are able to control their own lives. If you can brainwash those women into kink ideology, into sex work ideology, to either, like, I'm using strong language, but selling their sisters down the river, or themselves ending up, because we do see an increasing number of slightly wealthier women opting for the industry as well. If you can sell it to them, then you can reverse progress and maintain a hold on power. I certainly feel that there's a lot of truth in that. What do you think?
I think it is certainly a backlash. It also has to do with the sort of immediacy of online things. And some of the drivers are the way that the algorithms drive to extremes. In the days when you had sort of like paper, Penthouse, Playboy, all those sorts of things. So I met a few years ago somebody who was a Playboy Playmate of the Year back in the 60s and used to go around with Hugh Hefner, and he would ask her to sleep with different celebrities that he wanted to be in his burn of good books. And so she had done this with several very, very famous sort of actors and other public figures in the 60s. But that entire experience was one of missionary sex, and she didn't even receive oral sex until she got married. Whereas now it's the pushing on the other side is around exposure to extreme bodily fluids and things which are intentionally highly humiliating. So, and sort of humiliating and marking on the bodies of women. And I think it's very definitely that. And the way that some acts of violence that you see get shared on social media, it's almost if they're shot in a really porn POV way as well. Mm-hmm. I think it's kind of infiltrating lots of other forms of media. It also tends to make you feel kind of like helpless. It gives you this kind of real passivity. It's like bread and circuses from the Romans. It sort of makes people passive and kind of like, nothing can be done about it. Sort of accepting things as if it's being very fatalistic. Yes, very significant backlash.
Maybe we can end on something slightly more hopeful. I would want to ask you if you can give us a brief history of how you came to support the Nordic model and how you see the trajectory of the fight back against the industry and how society and policy might change, if not drastically, at least like going in the right direction in our lifetimes.
I support the Nordic model because nothing can make prostitution safe.
Yeah.
So it's more a matter of trying to control the demand for it and supporting women who are in it to exit if they want to. And that's really important also, that it should be something that they, that if they want to, you're going to support them to do so. Either to restrict the growth of the sex industry as far as possible, because also, sex trafficking is the most profitable kind of trafficking because you can reuse what you traffic multiple times.
Yes.
If you traffic drugs, they're consumed, that's it. But a person you can reuse multiple times. But if that person, once they get to a particular place where they can be supported to exit, then you'll lose that thing that you could recycle endlessly until they were a highly damaged person you could discard. So something which provides both exit and is tracking to reduce demand is very important. And there are lots of complaints about, what it would cost to do this to support women to exit. But the amount of money that was received by the UK Treasury from prostitution loss in 2023, so the most recent figures, was $6 billion. But our Office for National Statistics admits that the women themselves only receive 25% of that.
Yeah.
The rest of the cost of that go to other people.
Yeah.
And so there's no reason, that's nearly $4 billion. That's $4 billion. So there's no reason not to support that unless you are really just not interested in restricting the size of the sex industry. But I think quite a lot of young people have come around to realizing some things. Anyway, when we had this Everyone's Invited website that was set up about where girls in school could write in about their experiences of sexual assault, and there was something like 17,000 wrote in. And in my experience, having members of my family, that stimulated a lot of girls in their peer groups, of kind of teenage peer groups, to feel open about talking to their friendship groups about things that had happened to them. And so I think that on different levels, there are some reasons to be positive. But I think once people realize that it will all come down to zero if they have this kind of AI repetition of content and a lot of the digitalization, that the actual human beings in there, they're just a product and they're not of any value to the people who profit from the industry. I think some younger people are certainly coming to realize that.
Yes, I think so as well. They've told us being anti-sex industry is cobwebs of history. It's not from modern times. But I did just join the largest German network of locally organizing abolitionist organizations. And I'm so excited to see all these young people. So people in their 20s and early 30s who heard about this issue. And what's been key is, I always say this and it remains true, to hear from exited women, hear their experiences and analysis that's broken through the fog for so many young people and men as well. I was surprised how many young men there are. And they're able to connect that to their own experiences in some way, or the experiences of people close to them. And they are riled up to do something about it. That wasn't there 10 years ago, and it is now, and it's growing. So there's hope.
People realize that Andrew Tate is not a one-off. Andrew Tate is the generic Romeo pimp.
Yes.
And he was made out to be some particular demon of a one-off, but he really isn't. And I think people are understanding that more than they used to, and that it's not acceptable.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I hope that the legacy is going to eventually be raising awareness about human trafficking rather than, teaching young men to do it themselves, DIY.
Yes.
Okay, before we close, is there anywhere else than the Nordic Model Now website, which we will absolutely be linking, that people should go to find your writing, your work, or work by others, books that you would recommend reading?
Other than our website, there's quite a lot of information on the Filia website that we have. And some of the sites in North America, they're doing really great work. I went to the CAP International Congress in Montreal, which was really wonderful for not this year, last year. I can certainly send you some links of organizations who do really great work. And of course, I absolutely take my hat off to our French sisters, our young French feminist sisters, for what they have achieved against the porn industry and what they continue to achieve against the sex industry in general in France.
And I totally forgot to mention, of course, there is a huge push right now for the Nordic model in Scotland.
Yes.
That you and Nordic Model Now and some others have been involved in as well. And all fingers crossed over here from Germany. If Germany just gets surrounded, or even like on one side, like, we have other issues with the conservatives and them not wanting to touch this issue. The more countries in Europe go this way, the harder it'll be for Germany to refuse to enter the 21st century and actually commit to its supposed value of equality between the sexes and races and economically. All right. Thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll speak again because there was so much more that's there to cover. It was great to have you on. Thank you so much.
No, thank you very much, Elly, too. I look forward to seeing you again soon.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.